Today we're joined by Jason McClinton from Retail Council of Canada and Scott Smith from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Jason McClinton is RCC's Senior Director of Federal Government Relations. He is based out of our Ottawa office and advocates for members on most national files related to industry, health, food safety, product safety, and the environment. Previous to coming to RCC, Jason has over 15 years of experience with the Federal Public Service, working as a legislative and regulatory analyst for the Departments of Health and Environment. Smith is the Director of Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Director of Canadian Intellectual Property Institute. Scott leads the Canadian Chamber's advocacy activities in the areas of intellectual property protection, innovation and industry productivity, and research and development issues. Prior to joining the Chamber, Scott held senior management positions in the energy sector, automotive sector, municipal government, and the environment sector. Please welcome Jason and Scott.
I'm Scott Smith from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And we'd like to thank everyone for being on the call today to talk about this important issue, CASL, or Canada's new anti-spam legislation. On to the format for this webinar. I guess I would start by saying that we're going to focus primarily on commercial electronic messages. The name of the legislation is, of course, the anti-spam legislation, but it covers much more than fraudulent and malicious spam. It really will cover all forms of commercial electronic messaging, and even goes beyond commercial electronic messaging and looks at things like computer software, other sorts of things. Our focus of our talk today, though, is going to be on the provisions that relate to commercial electronic messages and emails, and those sorts of things that I think are going to be of most concern to RCC and CCC members. We're also going to be talking about who the new legislation will apply to, then went to a little bit of a contextual piece on the historical bit on why now. We'll do some key concepts that are probably new to most of you that are in the legislation and regulations. Then we're discussing some transition provisions that is provided in the regulations. And then the section that will probably be of most interest to folks here, the bits on preparing your business for compliance. And at the very end, we will have some time for some questions and answers.
Scott here, and I'll just walk you through quite a few things on the list of that first slide. So first, who does the law apply to? Well, it essentially applies to everyone. So if you're a not-for-profit corporation, it doesn't matter if you are an incorporated business, if you are a partnership business, or even if you're an individual. It applies to absolutely everybody with a couple of exemptions. There are exemptions, for example, for registered charities and for political parties who are seeking donations. Doesn't mean they are necessarily exempt from all forms of messages, only on the donations part. So if there's anything of a commercial nature that they are selling, they are still obligated to be compliant with the law. Why are they doing this now? The law's been around for quite some time, and suddenly it's in our face. Well, we talk about the fact that the government has been investigating what to do about spam for quite a number of years, 10 years now. The first public consultations and stakeholder groups were assembled in 2004. They didn't have legislation until 2010, and legislation doesn't come into force until regulations are adopted. That's why we're dealing with this now. The regulations were adopted in December of 2013, and they dated a coming into force date of July 1st, 2014 for the commercial electronic messages component, and for January 15th of 2015 for computer programs. Really what we're waiting for now, and there may be a few gaps in this presentation, is enforcement guidelines from the CRTC, Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. There have been some guidelines put out by the CRTC over the course of the last year. Those were to the final Industry Canada regulations being adopted, so there may be some changes to those. And understanding that CRTC is going to begin a public awareness campaign or regular meetings across the country beginning sometime in February. What the key concepts are. First is, what is a commercial electronic message? And I'll refer to them here out as a CEM. It says consent. You send a CEM without having somebody's permission. CEM. There's going to be certain types of information that you have to include in every message that you send. Those things is going to be your identification information, and the other is an unscribed mechanism. You got to keep records. That's probably the most important factor for keeping you out of trouble. Is the burden of proof is on you, and you need to be able to prove that you had consent. I'm going to talk a little bit about the penalties. There are types of penalties in the law, both administrative and civil. The civil side has actually been delayed, which is a positive thing for those who are trying to comply at this point. So this slide is for me to make sense of it first, and what I'm going to try and do is make sense for everybody online. This is the crux of what CASTLE is all about and how a CEM is defined. Next page, what does it actually mean? If you're sending a message that entices someone to buy something, it's CEM. You also have to know that if you are sending a message with gathering consent or permission to send them a CEM, that's considered a CEM, and you can't do it. You have to find some other means. CEMs would include anything like emails, SMS texts, instant messages, social networking messages. Those are all considered electronic messages. What's considered an electronic message is anything that's done by telephone or voice communication. That would include like mail. That's not an electronic communication, so it's not part of the Act. We're saying that the majority of business to consumer messages are commercial. So those ones that you're going to have to pay the most attention to. Business to business communications are also commercial. I'll get into that in a little more detail and explain what I mean by that in some of the exemptions. So I mentioned it's the CCC who is responsible for the enforcement of this Act and its regulations. They will be the ones to make the determination of what constitutes a commercial electronic message. And it's going to be based on primarily the content, but what the intent of the message is, and what links might be in the message. For example, if the message is very clearly, a letter item where you are inviting people to come and peruse the products that you are selling, or service that you are selling, that's a CEM. Alternatively, you are sending a purely informational note to a distribution list. That informational note has absolutely no commercial content. You're not trying to sell them anything. Likely not a commercial electronic message. Unless you have web links in there that you are pointing to and enticing people to sign on to, and that website has commercial content, then it could be considered an EM, and you need to take that into consideration. EM, you have to have consent to send it, or you have to fit into one of the exemptions in the regulations. So what we hear is that there's no exception to what a CEM is. It either is or it is not. If commercial content, it is. There are, however, some exemptions to what rule lie, depending on who you're sending it to when you're sending it. What are the exemptions? First, we need to know that even if a message is a CEM, you will not need consent to do the following things: to send notification upon request, to complete action, warranty, recall, or safety information. There's a few other very limited exceptions. First is the message, if the message that is sent is a refer to someone who has a business or non-business relationship. And I'll explain what those are in a few minutes. But basically, for instance, if you are a real estate agent and you have done work for one client and that client consents to say, yeah, you can use my name as a referral to somebody I know, Bob, you can call them and tell them that I think your service is great. In instances, you are allowed to send one commercial electronic message to Bob saying that John gave you consent to call to contact him, and do you consent to further electronic messages? Do you want to meet? You cannot more than that. If they no, they no longer contact that person. Second is if you are sending to a closed messaging system. That means you have control over the platform. So an example of this would be a bank where they have an internal email system and you are sending messages strictly to that internal email system where the person has control whether they are a client of yours or not. That does not apply. The message is sent outside of Canada and there's spam law in that country and complies with that law. You do not need to comply with CASL. You need to comply with other law. For example, if you are sending messages into the United States, you need to comply with CAN-SPAM. What I will throw in here for you is you need to be aware that if you are sending messages to the United States, fail to comply with CAN-SPAM, you are liable under both CAN-SPAM and CASL. So there's a double jeopardy there. It's a point in that you have a different compliance requirement at a lower threshold, but also liable for two different laws then.
I would just add, if I may, that I think pretty much without exception, the anti-spam requirements in other jurisdictions are less stringent than those that appear in CASL.
Which is correct. There is a schedule of countries in the regulation that tell you which ones have spam laws. That will be modified over time as those laws change in different countries, and that will be Industry Canada monitoring those laws. The last exemption is if the contact information of the person to whom the message is sent is conspicuously published on the World Wide Web. That means it has to be in a clearly identifiable place where they are accepting commercial electronic messages. So the caveat I will throw in there is if somebody happens to remove their contact information from a conspicuously published website, then you need to be aware of that and stop sending them messages. In these cases, you are still required to include subscribed information and unsubscribe mechanism. Start with what is consent. Basically, anybody who receives a CEM from you has given you permission to do so ahead of time. You can't proactively get their consent. It has to be upfront. There's two types of consent. The first is express, when somebody gave you their active permission to have a positive action. The second, implied, meaning it would be reasonable to conclude that you've got somebody's permission to send them a CEM, and that's based on prior relationships. I'm going to go through those in a little bit more detail separately. Know that you cannot send an electronic message asking for this permission after July 1st. So if you want to create a list of people that you want to send to and you're looking for their express consent, that's something you'll need to do between now and July. Consent, as I said, is an active, positive indication that someone wishes to receive a CEM. So that can be in any one of a number of different forms. You can have them sign up on your website. You can have them respond to a contest or a coupon offer, although you can't send them that coupon offer by electronic means. You can have sign up at point of sale. So, if you have electronically collecting email addresses at point of sale, you can use that. Or you can have them sign up over the phone. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a couple of examples. So what you can do is pre-toggle. In other words, you can't have a pre-checked box that they agree to receive your newsletters or promotions or what have you. You have a positive action, so they actually have to click it. That's That's basically the way you can do this. An example of acquiring express consent is, yes, it's a coupon offer. This is on your website. You can't send them an email for this. But on your website, you can have them in their email address, and by that public action saying, it's very clearly stated in the on your website that they are subscribing to your newsletter, that is considered acceptable. And I think the point here is it has to be opt-in versus opt-out. You may hear that thrown about in various other seminars, what have you. The point of CASEL is one of the few in the world that is an opt-in regime versus an opt-out, whereas something like CAN-SPAM is opt-out. So the opt-out means you can have that pre-toggle box. CASEL, you can't. So another example of what you cannot do. If somebody has asked for a coupon on your website and given you their email address to do so, you can't send them. I think I've got this wrong.
No, that's right. But whether the example here is that whether it's on a website or whether it's done point of sale, it's not explicitly telling the person why you are requesting their email address, and that is to send them electronic messages, then you cannot send them commercial electronic messages. So in this instance, let's say at the point of sale there's a coupon or a draw, or to win a vacation or something like that, and the person has to enter their email in order to qualify for that draw. That is not expressed consent because you have not told them why you're gathering their email. So you can give them this coupon, but then you could not subsequently send them commercial electronic messages. I know that this is a fairly popular practice right now with a lot of businesses, so this will likely mean change to the way some people conduct their operations.
Okay. So on the next slide, as an example, this is what Jason was referring to, you cannot do. So you sent them a copy of the coupon, but you cannot tie the I agree to receive company incorporated's newsletter with that coupon, because that is basically the same thing as asking for consent through an electronic message.
That's exactly right, Scott. And in addition to that, in a follow-up, so let's assume, we'll go back that slide here, and let's assume that you've asked at the point of sale or on your website for someone to submit their email address or to receive the coupon or to be entered into a draw. You July 1st, after Canada Day 2014, you cannot follow up on that entry or that request for a coupon with a request to receive commercial electronic messages, because as Scott had pointed out earlier in the presentation, after July 1st, an email requesting permission to send CEMs in itself will be considered to be a CEM.
Start walking through the implied consent. An attempt to make things easier for businesses and individuals to send information by electronic means, the regulations give a series of exemptions. So, for instance, a family relationship. If you have a family relationship with somebody, you are exempt from the portions of the law. So, it's related by marriage or parent-child relationship, and you can demonstrate that you've had two-way communication, and you are exempt. A personal relationship. So, it's a friend or it is somebody that you go to a club with. Those relationships, it works the same as if you had a family relationship. There's also what they call a business or non-business relationship, and those have several exemptions from the Section 6 of the Act, and I only refer to that because that's the prescribed information and the unsubscribed mechanism. So you're exempt from those for certain types of messages between businesses. Even if a message is a CEM, CASEL does not apply, so consent will not be required for messages that are within an organization, so internal email, for instance, between organizations that have a relationship. So if you can clearly demonstrate that you are working with another company, if it's a contractor-supplier type relationship, ownership. You need to comply with CASL to satisfy a complaint. You need to comply with CASL to respond to an inquiry. So if somebody sent you a message, you are within your rights to send a reply. You do not need to comply with CASL to satisfy a legal obligation. So completion of contracts, those types of things. There's no requirement to include the prescribed information or the unsubscribe mechanism for these types of messages. A couple of other considerations you need to make with respect to consent. So separately, if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you can't ask for different types of consent in the same agreement. And that often gets referred to as a click-wrap agreement. So you cannot ask for consent to send CEMs and a computer program in the same checkbox. They have to be separated out. You can't bundle consent. CCMs cannot be tied to any agreement or purchase or contest. It can't be all that you can't require consent to send messages to participate in a contest, for instance. Some examples for acquiring separate consent. These are again just different options, and these can be either on mobile devices or on a website, as an example. So a couple of examples on how not to acquire consent. And this is, as we suggested earlier, a part of the terms of conditions. For a purchase and sale, terms of conditions for use of a website, terms of conditions for use of publications, what have you. You cannot tie a agreement or ask for consent based on that terms and conditions.
So thank you, Scott, for that. I would probably the two major areas that are of interest when it comes to commercial electronic messages, those portions of the legislation and regulations, have to do with exactly what Scott was talking about, the consent provisions, and also now the form and content of what commercial electronic messages will have to look like as of July 1st, 2014. And I would basically break the form and content requirements, or the prescribed information requirements, into two main groupings. The first grouping is the identification, and the second grouping would be the unsubscribe mechanism. The first one, with regard to identification, all CEMs under CASL must do the following. They must identify who sent the message, and this is very important, and identify on whose behalf the message was sent, which is often not the same thing if you're dealing with a marketing agency or something like that. It has to identify both. In addition to that, it must provide contact information for both of the above. And I have it's something that I have from the slide. It means snail mail addresses, but it also means that you must provide, in addition to that snail mail address, either an email address or I think it's
a phone number, an email address, or a web address.
Or a web address, right. And just to print questions around the snail mail address, it does not necessarily need to be your physical mailing address. It can be a P.O. box as well. A lot of questions around that in terms of people that have private businesses that they run out of their home. So a P.O. box would be considered acceptable as well. The addresses must be valid for a minimum of 60 days after the message is sent.
So one thing to keep in mind on the 60 days after consent is if you are moving your business, if you are changing your business model, if you are changing your phone number, for instance, you make sure that the last message that you sent, no changes to those addresses occur within that 60 days.
The second portion is the unsubscribe mechanism. So it must be in the same electronic means as the CEM that you sent. When that's not practical, such as an SMS text, and by other electronic means that are reasonably accessible, such as a web address. Important note here is that the unsubscribe mechanism must be clear and prominent, easily accessible, and included in every single CEM that you send as of July 1st moving forward. It must be no cost to the receiver, and of course, it has to work. So if somebody unsubscribes from receiving commercial electronic messages from you, you have to stop sending them. Email. This week's special, 40% off everything in the store. This message was sent to you by agency ABC on behalf of XYZ. So it's telling you both who has sent the message and on whose behalf. It's providing a snail address. It always, as I said, it would also need to provide an email address or a phone number or a web address. And there's an unsubscribe, an easily accessible unsubscribe mechanism at the bottom. Now, as Scott had mentioned before, we have the consent mechanism. We have the consent requirement. We also have the form and content requirements. But there's also the burden of proof. These consents have to be verifiable, and that's for the obvious reason that if there's a complaint or an investigation or something like that, you would need to be able to demonstrate that you have consent. So therefore, you must have a record of how the consent was acquired. For consent, that means an electronic database, paper record, audio file, other means to record the date, time, circumstance, active permission of the receiver. And I just wanted to point something out here, if it hasn't come up yet, and if it doesn't come up moving forward, is that oral consent, I think Scott mentions over the telephone, but also at point of sale, oral consent is going to be considered to be acceptable, again, as long as you have the required information and you have the records to demonstrate that the person has given their express consent. So that might be a little bit more tricky and may involve a little bit more training of staff, but verbal consent will be considered to be acceptable. For consent, that means a record of the nature of the relationship and record of any two-way communications, preferred copies of electronic communication. So what that means is if you have a family relationship or a personal relationship or a business-to-business relationship, that you will be able to demonstrate that should the need arise. Scott, for penalties.
Okay. So I'll try to explain this as best I can. You get the word AMPS, which is administrative monetary penalties. And anybody ever had a parking ticket? That's essentially what that is. It's a fine. The intent of the fines, or the AMPS, are for compliance. This is not a criminal prosecution. So the intent for the CRTC enforcement, I think, is going to be to comply with law, and it will be commensurate with the infraction. So if you can demonstrate due diligence, the likelihood is you will not be fined, but the fine might be quite considerably less. If you cannot demonstrate due diligence and you have no records, you're probably in line for something significant. If you do it multiple times, there's a maximum penalty of $1 million for individuals to $10 million for organizations. When organizations, that means any not-for-profit corporation, a limited partnership, it doesn't matter. If you're a business or a not-for-profit corporation, that puts you in the organization category, and it can be up to $10 million. As I said, those penalties are imposed by the CRTC or their designate, so that means CRTC staff. You're going to differentiate between the commission and the staff. And they are, as I said, intended to encourage compliance. Okay, next slide. Appeal to the federal court. So if you assessed one of those fines, you do have an option to try and get that either quashed or reduced. And according to the law, you're not liable if you can clearly demonstrate that due diligence, as I said. The other aspect of this is civil, and it's referred to as a RA, or a private right of action. And that basically means anybody that feels they have been wronged can organize a class action suit against you. Fortunately, we have been able to get the private action provisions of the Act delayed. So in the regulations in December, it's very clearly laid out that the PRA provisions have been delayed for 3 years. Now, within a 3-year period, there will be a requirement for a legislative review. So we'll keep you apprised as best we can of any changes or actions on the private action. Next one, transition. The law come into force until July 1st, 2014. Okay, pretty soon. There are provisions next slide. There are provisions in the Act that do things for that period between now and when the legislation is reviewed in 2017. So, for example, one of the transition provisions is your existing consents. So existing consents, as long as they conform to the requirements, are going to be considered acceptable. So, for instance, if you have express consents, whether they were toggled or untoggled, it doesn't. This is our interpretation at this point. It doesn't matter. It will still be considered acceptable. Elections have come in around consents obtained under PIPEDA. It probably will not be acceptable, largely because the PIPEDA consents were for a different purpose, and there was no information indicating that that individual gave their consent to receive electronic messages. And not confirmed. We're still waiting for the guidelines from CRTC on this, but our advice at this point is that those would not be acceptable.
Basically, if you have, like Scott said, whether it's toggled, pre-toggled, whether it has, all, the information of who sent it and on whose behalf, that kind of stuff, as we stand at this point, is not relevant for consents obtained prior to July 1st. The consent to have been requesting that messages of a commercial nature be sent. So whether it meets all those form and prescription requirements or not doesn't matter. So as long as you said, hey, do we have your permission to send the commercial electronic messages, then you would be fine. If you have the example of that we had provided where you would ask for an email address to enter a competition or something like that, and you just started sending people commercial electronic messages based on that, our interpretation at this point is that that will likely not qualify as express consent going forward past July 1st.
I think the point to keep in mind here is that as you have collected consents over the years, and some of you have been doing, I think, this for a long time, if it's been made clear to the individual, and you can prove that it was made clear to the individual the purpose of your sending electronic messages, and they have given you some kind of action, whether toggled, pre-toggled, email us, doesn't really matter. As long as you can demonstrate that and you've done your diligence on the demonstration of that, you should be fine with the existing list that you have. If you can't prove it, then you're going to have to go back to the drawing board. The thing I would just, if I may, at this point suggest is, there's the 2-year transition period that applies, when there is consent. That also includes, as Scott has mentioned, there's express and implied consent. In case of business-to-business relationship, as I mentioned about the burden of proof, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that you have that existing business relationship. And so the one caution that I would mention is that when people are dealing in a cash transaction type scenario, you may have an existing business relationship with your client, but given the nature of the transaction, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to prove that you have that existing business relationship. And what you need to keep in mind on the transition is that after July 1st, even those, whether your consents were CASL compliant or not, you will still be required for all future electronic messages going forward. Those will have to include the specified information and an unsubscribe mechanism if you're not currently doing that. A couple of other cautions. The CRTC released an FAQ in December. Again, we'll talk about the determining if the message constitutes a CEM. They'll likely be decided on a case-by-case basis. They'll have to build basically a database of here's what constitutes a CEM and here's what does not.
And so, sorry, Scott, at the risk of stating the obvious, this does not constitute or is not meant as a replacement for legal advice. This is all going to be done on a case-by-case basis as the law comes into effect.
So in practical terms, some of the consents that you got before coming into force won't be acceptable, and you need to be aware of that and be prepared to deal with that as of July 1st. And our key message here is make sure you err on the side of caution. If you're not sure, then go the other way and get your express consents before July 1st.
So a couple of things that you can start doing right away before July 1st is have a review or audit your current processes. Who are you currently sending messages to, and do you have a personal or family or some other sort of relationship with those folks that would therefore qualify you for some partial or full exemptions? What content of these messages, are they truly commercial in nature or not? Have proper consent, express or implied, to send these messages. And as Scott suggested, if you don't, you have until July 1st to send an electronic message in order to try to garner that consent. How are you to prove that you have consent? You have records, and if in the case that they need to be verified, are you able to produce those records? How to manage requests to unsubscribe moving forward, and that properly trained, particularly in the instances where you're looking to gain express consent at a point of sale. You can do starting right now. You can start you can get, as we've mentioned numerous times in this presentation already, the electronic means. You have until July 1st, 2014 to get consent for your current mailing lists if you're not certain that they're already covered. After July 1st, electronic messages requesting consent will themselves be considered CEMs. You don't have this in the slides. You may wish to consider starting to get new CASL compliant consents now. That's a requirement until July 1st, but you could start now to get new CASL compliant consents. In addition, to start maintaining records of the consents. What we're doing as of July 1st, of course, nothing precludes you starting to do this now, but as of July 1st, the following will be required. Start including the form and content requirements that I mentioned, including the identification sections as well as the unsubscribe mechanism, unless an exemption applies. July 1st, you can no longer send a commercial electronic message as your first point of contact. And of course, the entire point of the legislation, as a first, stop sending CEMs without consent. Next, Industry Canada and the CRTC have indicated that they will be putting sessions on for industry where you can interact directly with the regulator and the enforcement agency in February and March. Please announce that we have been given notice that the first session will be on February 5th in Toronto, and you can register at the following email address. I intend to be there in person, and please feel free to write to that address directly in order to register for that session. We're looking into the possibility of having targeted sessions for RCC and CCC members so that you will have the opportunity to specifically have your questions addressed by the regulator and enforcement agency, and as well to focus on those provisions of the legislation and regulations that pertain most closely to your operations. In addition to that, I can confirm that we are working on a compliance checklist that we intend on releasing in the coming weeks for folks to be able to use to ensure they're in compliance with the new requirements.
Sam have asked a question about the presentation that will be made available, and yes, it will be available both on the Canadian Chamber of Commerce website and the RCC website.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. What we're going to do now, what I would encourage folks to do, I see that a number of you have already done this already in the chat portion of in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, is to submit questions, which we now have a little bit of time to take. What we will do now is there are a number of questions. I gave a similar webinar a few months ago when the Canada Gazette Part 1 proposed regulations had been pre-published. There were questions that came out of that webinar that I've included at the end of this presentation, which Scott and I will answer now just to sort of get things going. I encourage you to submit your questions at this time. There will be a short, perhaps 5-minute pause at the end of the example questions and answers, where Scott and I will be reviewing the questions that you submit, and then we will come back online and we will attempt to answer your questions. The caveat that I would again mention, it was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that we are very fortunate to have representatives from Industry Canada and the CRTC as observers in this presentation. If you would not like to be identified, please send your questions to the panelists only. And of course, if you would like to identify, you may do so if you send it to all participants. Another reminder that this does not constitute, is not meant as a replacement for legal advice. The very last thing I would throw out there is that that are more technical in nature or specifically relate to your specific business operations may be harder for us to get at today. We're looking for more of the general questions and the questions that are likely to impact a number of members. So those that are specifically related to your business, we will be happy, if we don't get to them today, we will be happy to follow up with you directly on them afterwards. And at the very end of this presentation, you'll have Scott and my contact information. Other avenue would be for you to follow up with us directly. I'll move into some sample questions and answers.
Okay, so the ones that we had previously, and we'll just walk through them very quickly because I think there's quite a few questions that I see on the chat box already. So first, can we continue to use third-party lists that we purchased previously? So I say yes in most cases, as long as you have that record that we talked about quite extensively, and the future messages have the prescribed information and unsubscribe mechanism. So what you're cognizant of is, are you satisfied that the third party you got that distribution list from is reputable and has done due diligence? Because ultimately, you're going to be the one responsible. Using that list, you need to be able to demonstrate where those consents came from and whether or not they're valid.
So Scott, one of the questions I've seen come up in the corner of the chat box already is if you purchased this from somebody who got this via, the web page listings online or something like that, that therefore not satisfy that requirement.
That would definitely not satisfy that requirement because that list has come from somewhere where somebody didn't actively or even, or even opt out of. They didn't have any choice in the matter. So they didn't give any kind of participation. They weren't on your website, what have you. They never gave any kind of consent, so you can't rely on that.
Great. Next question. Can I send a message to all my customers to announce the legal changes and then ask that they respond via a survey or whatever to confirm or deny that they are providing consent? I think probably if we've touched on anything in this presentation, it's probably been this one. The short answer is before July 1st, yes. After July 1st, no. After July 1st, yes, if you have consent, which sort of amplifies the point, right? Like, why would you be asking consent if you already have the consent? No, if you have a record of how the electronic address was acquired before July 1st, 2014, consent is considered implied until the 3-year transition period is over, as Scott was talking about the transition period, unless, of course, the recipient unsubscribes during this period.
So, can I send messages to all my customers to announce, okay, so we just did that one. I'm behind. Can I send a CEM to another business without express consent? Does it have to contain an unsubscribe mechanism? So we did cover this in the slides. In some cases, yes, the business-to-business communications are exempt from the form and content requirements, but they have to be within those specific exemptions. So it's within an existing business, within a business that has a relationship with another business, So if it's a contractor-supplier relationship, or if it's a supplier-manufacturer relationship, or if it's a some service relationship, those are all exempt. There are some caveats to that. So I'll take an example of a supplier relationship. Those relationships tend to be in the 5-year range, 3 to 5 years. If at the end of that 3 to 5 year relationship, the supplier is discontinued for another supplier and they move on to somebody else, and the supplier doesn't have any electronic communications with who are supplying, then for a period of a couple of years, the limit is 2 years, then they no longer have that business relationship. So, the exemption would no longer apply.
The question we got was, I work for an industry association and often send commercial electronic messages to my members. Does them exempt from the requirement for express consent? I assume the reference here is to having an existing business relationship. What are form and content of CEMs? If they unsubscribe from receiving a CEM from me, can I still send them their renewal notice? That is that an industry association is, of course, a corporation. You can send a CEM to another business, so business-to-business exemption that we've been talking about, without express consent, as long as you have a relationship and you can demonstrate that. You have records. Business communications are exempt from the form and content requirements and therefore not have to contain an unsubscribe mechanism. That being said, in practical terms, you may wish to include an unsubscribe mechanism to messages such as newsletters, and advertisements. It is also important to note that the membership prospects may not be covered under this business exemption, and what that means is going to a potential member and using a commercial electronic message as that first point of contact.
As we sell through distribution, would we be considered having an existing business relationship with the end customer? Does this mean we're exempt from the requirement for express consent? What about the form and content of CEMs? So, it really depends on who your end customer is. If you sell by distribution to another business and you have a regular business relationship with that other business, then no, you are exempt. If, however, you are a business that works through distribution and the distributor is the one that has the relationship with the end user, who is perhaps an individual or a customer, then no, you are not exempt, and you need to collect that consent. So an example of this would be vehicle manufacturers, where vehicle manufacturers don't necessarily have a relationship with the people who drive cars. It's the dealer who has those relationships. So if that gap, then you need to go through the dealer to get a referral, or you need to some other mechanism, some other way of gathering consent. So the next question is, how long do we need to maintain records of consent? And basically, the answer is quite simple there. It's for as long as you intend to communicate with the receiver. If you communicate with the person, there may be an issue with regards to compliance or enforcement activity, and you will be required to demonstrate that you have that consent. In simple terms, it's prudent to keep those records well beyond the last communication date, if ever you decide to send another commercial electronic message after that date. The law stipulates that a preceding message may be initiated, may be initiated up to 3 years after the violation was noted by the CRTC. So your taxes, you got to keep them for 7 years, because Revenue Canada can come back after you for 7 years. Well, in this case, it's 3 years. The CRT can an investigation and a proceeding. At a show, would scanning a person's badge be considered consent if they agree? Would the list derived from show management be used as proof of consent? So again, the question here comes down to express opt-in verifiable consent. So if just as part of the normal trade show you were scanning someone's badge or getting their name, and then can you start sending them CEMs as a result of that? No. If it is bundled in with attending the conference or trade show, that is a condition upon them going to that trade show that they also have to consent to receiving EMs, no, because you cannot bundle multiple requests. But if, as the person signing into the trade show, or they're going to various booths or something like that,
you are asking for their express consent for you to send them CEMs, and the method that you're collecting their information is scanning the badge as opposed to them writing down their email address, then that would be fine. It comes down to express, opt-in, and verifiable consent.
Okay, so the one that we had predetermined the questions here for you was, for conferences or trade shows, would e-blasts to previous attendees to let them know online registration is now open, or a reminder to register? Okay. Would this be a case of a business relationship that does not require express consent as long as they have attended or pre-registered in the past 2 years? So yes, this would be true for most existing business relationships. In other words, if you are an association that's sending out to your members, you have that business relationship. Often going to be attendees who are not your members but have purchased something from you in the past. So you do have an implied relationship there, but it has to be within 2 years. So if there's been no communication, two-way communication, in other words, they haven't sent anything back to you within 2 years, that second year you cannot send something to them.
Great. And as we've mentioned a couple of times now, this presentation will be made available both on the Retail Council of Canada website as well as the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's website. And you'll have access to all of these links. But just to go through them very quickly, for first, there's the Act itself. If ever you're bored on a Saturday night and have nothing else to do, you can curl up by the fire and read a nice big thick piece of legislation. Most of the new requirements are listed in the Act, which was, as Scott mentioned, was passed in 2009 and will be coming into force July 1st, 2014. There's the last version of the proposed regulations, and I say the last version because they went through two proposed iterations. So the final version of the I should say the final version of the regulations that do key terms and list exemptions. This is actually, my apologies, this is an outdated link from last presentation when it was still proposed. So the final version of the regulations were published on December 18th of 2014, and I will update this presentation before we put it on so that you have access to the final version of the regulations. The enforcement agency, the CRTC, has issued regulations and interpretation bulletins, as well as frequently asked questions just as recently as this December, to help clarify how they interpret and intend to enforce the new rules. And here.
And one other thing I can mention is there is one place you can go to access all of these, and that is the Industry Canada website. It's www.fightspam.ca.
And to thank everyone for their time today. We will be taking questions after a short, perhaps a 2 to 3 minute pause. It will give us a moment to have a look at the questions that have been submitted. And any questions that we do not get to today, feel free to follow up with either one of us, and you will see our contact information that will be displayed throughout the rest of the question and answer period. So thank you very much, and we will be back to answer questions in 2 or 3 minutes. This is Jason McClinton here with the Retail Council of Canada, of course joined by my colleague Scott Smith with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We've had a moment now to look over some of your questions quickly, and then we'll take a moment to try to answer some of them. I'll just scroll to the top here. There was about emails sent internally within a company, whether consent was required from, say, the president or somebody in the company to send electronic messages of a commercial nature to their employees at their work email address. And the answer to that is CASL does not cover that. There's an exemption for that. That if you are communicating to employees within your business, that is exempt from those requirements. Question is, what if we ask people to volunteer for an event? And I think the answer to that question is, if the electronic messages is not primarily commercial in nature, that would not qualify as a commercial electronic message, and that would therefore not be covered under CASL.
The only caveat there is if you're asking them to volunteer, their time is one thing, but if there's any monetary element to it and you are not a registered charity, then no, you're not exempt. There's a question here about our members receive daily industry communications from us as part of their membership benefits package. Can we send an email to our members with information about CASL and how to ensure they continue receiving our communications? This would fall into the business exemption. They are your existing members, so you have an existing business relationship.
Question here about third-party vendors. If we are improving in providing the third-party vendor with the prescribed information and unsubscribe mechanism to that vendor, but they don't include it when they send emails on our behalf, who is accountable, who pays the fine. And so I think that basically, as I understand it, you cannot send a commercial electronic message to a recipient unless you can demonstrate that you have, after July 1st, the CASL requirement for consent. So you would not be able to send a commercial electronic message unless you were able to demonstrate that consent was obtained. So if you're not sure you're dealing with a vendor that is doing that properly, that behooves you to not send those messages. First, a contact list from sponsors/vendors. One is a list of contacts from the white pages. Historically, it has not been a concern because it is public information. Would it fall into the category of implied consent? And the answer to that is no. The conspicuously published argument does not apply to white pages lists. So conspicuously published, which of course Scott mentioned in the presentation, is where somebody has their name and an email address saying, this is the business that they're involved in, and that they would be pleased to receive commercial electronic messages of whatever nature. That clearly is not the intent of the white pages.
And really what we have to keep in mind here is white pages don't include email addresses. White pages are for addresses and for phone numbers. Addresses and phone numbers are not applicable to this law. This law is not applicable to those. You can send, you have to follow the rules of the do not call list, but CASL does not apply to this.
The person on to ask, if not, and we just not, if not, can we rely on the sponsor or vendor to get express consent and sharing it with us? Again, the first point of contact after July 1st to get consent cannot be a commercial electronic message. If it were by some other means, that would be acceptable, but not through an electronic message.
So the sponsor or vendor would have to acquire those express consents in advance of July 1st if they want to do it electronically, or if they have other means they can do it after July 1st.
And they, of course, would have to identify on whose behalf the message is being sent and for what intent, so that the person knows exactly what they're signing up for. There's about whether there's a time limit on the inquiry or application exemption. So we mentioned that there would be an exemption. You could reply to someone if they make a business inquiry. And the question is there a time limit around that?
So the response to that is inquiries are exempt, so you're responding to the inquiry, but that's all you can do is respond to that specific inquiry. You cannot send any other types of messages without consent. I don't think there is I don't think there's a time limit on that, but I mean, for your own purposes, it's probably wise to not let it go several years before you respond to an inquiry.
What information should we get from people when we request express consent? First and last name and email address? The answer to that, as I understand it, is that there really hasn't been a lot of guidance issued on that. What we know is that you need to be able to demonstrate that you have the express consent of the owner of that electronic address. I think it would probably be prudent to have their, perhaps, the name associated with that electronic address. But as long as you have a record demonstrating that you have express consent from the owner of that address, send the message. That's what's currently is what's being asked for.
So if you have a current list that you have been using with correct permissions, but have not kept the backup of those permissions, do you need to junk the list and start over? Essentially, yes.
We appreciate the candidness of your questions.
I mean, in the end, it's all about records and being able to prove that you have that consent. If you can't prove you have that consent, you essentially don't have that consent.
Next, how does this apply to fundraising type emails sent internally? Suppose an employee that's affiliated with a charitable organization sends an email to a group regarding information session or fundraising. So I think that this has already been addressed with one of the earlier questions, is that messages sent within an organization are not covered by CASL.
So part of that is on the charitable organization. There are going to be cases where you're sending it to maybe somebody that's not internal. If it's an organization, it has to be a registered charitable organization. So the example of your children's hockey team or Girl Guides or Cub Scouts, sometimes those are not registered charities. And if your message is beyond your own organization, then no, you can't do that.
There's a question here about the provisions in CASL that relate to the computer programs, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We have decided not to focus on, given the fact that the majority of folks on the line, with the limited time that we have, we wanted to focus on provisions that we know impact pretty much everyone on the line, and those are the ones that have to do with commercial electronic messages. But to respond to the question on expanding on this, different parts of the law, different requirements will be coming into force at different times. July 1st, 2014 for the CENs. I believe it's
January 15th.
January 15th for the computer provisions. 2015 for the computer provisions, and then the private right of action not for another 3 years until July 1st of 2017. Scott, I don't know if you wanted to talk very briefly about the computer program provisions.
Yeah, so the computer program provisions, there was a lot of concern amongst the app developers, as an example, about the coming into force date and being able to comply with the provisions of CASL within their given product cycle. And I think the reason for delaying the implementation of the computer program provisions of the Act was to allow those companies the time to prepare for compliance.
Next question. At point of sale for a number of years, I have assigned an email book for customers to receive email notifications for future sales. Emails will include an unsubscribe mechanism. Does the existing email list meet the consent requirements? I'm happy to report that yes, it sounds like your book would meet the consent requirements. I would just caution that as of July 1st, 2014, that all of the information, either verbally or in your book, be provided so that the person knows who will be sending on whose behalf it will be will be sent, and that you maintain a record of that.
So the question, does membership within a membership organization, such as a local board or chamber, qualify as either within an organization or existing relationship? And the simple answer to that is yes.
How long is existing business relationship valid for? Does it have an expiry date? The answer is yes. There's actually a quite detailed, if not complicated, definition of exactly what constitutes an existing business relationship, and it is defined in the Act. And basically, what it states is that if you've had, an exchange of some sort, if you've sold, any sort of bartering, that sort of thing, that existing business relationship is considered valid for 2 years. And there's one shorter caveat that if there's been an inquiry, that would be considered an existing business relationship for a 6-month period. Would it be able to receive a copy of this presentation? Again,
yes, those will be available online. Sought separately provision. Would an individual checkbox among others on a paper membership form comply? As I went through the how you collect consent provisions in the presentation, what you do is separate what you're collecting consent for. So if you're consent to send electronic messages, you cannot put in the same paragraph with the same checkbox that you're also collecting consent to send or to install computer programs, as an example. If you're on paper, that's fine, but it still has to be a separate checkbox for each type of consent that you're asking for.
So, example, then, that's exactly right. Another example would be, one is requesting consent for something else. The second one would be for commercial electronic messages. A third one could be, opting in for something else. That's all fine as long as the request to receive commercial electronic messages is not bundled in with the others. It can appear on the same page with other things, but as long as that is staying on its own and the person checks that one box for that one purpose, then you're okay.
So, on behalf of message, whose contact information must be included? ABC company, XYZ company, or both? So, in this case, it is both. The information that's required, as we indicated earlier, is a mailing address. Now, the mailing can be either your physical mailing address or a P.O. box. You also have to include a telephone number, a website address, or an email address for both.
We have a comment here that someone has suggested that the Toronto session may already be full, the one that we advertised for February 5th. I will follow up with government to see whether there is in fact additional room available there or not. What I can tell you is that they are planning additional sessions, not just in Toronto but across the country in the coming months. And as I said, we're also exploring with them the possibility of having member-specific sessions as well.
Next, after giving consent to an organization, does the consent expire? So there's two answers to that. If it's an express consent, the only that will expire is if somebody unsubscribes. Otherwise, there is no expiry date. The consent goes on. The implied consent could expire depending on the two-way communications between the two individuals. So if there is a 3-year period where there is no communication between somebody in that personship, then the consent could be considered to have expired.
You discussed having staff properly trained to collect email addresses at the sale. Can you expand on this? Well, that would depend on the method that you are using to collect permission, consent to send CEMs. If you're collecting consent at point of sale, then you don't have to worry about that. If you are collecting consent at point of sale, it depends. If you have a sheet that has all of the consent requirements in that piece of paper, and the person, that's a standalone piece of paper, and it's obvious on its own. The person inputs, they write down the email address and it. then the amount of training I would imagine for your staff at point of sale would be fairly limited. You do, of course, have the possibility of having this done in a largely oral format, partially or almost entirely oral, where you could have your staff reading the requirements, the consent requirements, and making it clear what the email address would be used for, and either the person verbally providing their email address as a result of that, and the cashier or whomever writing it down, or some other form of collecting the electronic address. The difficulty there then is that you would have to train your staff about exactly what points they would have to hit on, and then they would then need to maintain a record of that so that you could demonstrate that you got express and opt-in consent.
Question is, do information newsletters that include links to sites such as the Globe and Mail count as CEMs? I think there's a couple of points to that question that we're going to have to tear apart in order to be able to answer that. The first is, what is the content of the newsletter? Who is the newsletter being distributed to? And the third is, what is being pointed to in the Globe and Mail? The first question is, does your newsletter have any advertising in it? If it does, it's a CEM. If it's strictly information, then it may not be a CEM. Second is, who's it being distributed to? Do you send from the people that you are distributing the newsletter? If you do, you don't have to worry about it. You can send them whatever you want. If you have consent and you want to send them a newsletter, and the newsletter is strictly informational purposes, you're probably okay, depending on the link to the Globe and Mail. Globe and Mail is going to have commercial content, but if the intent of the is strictly to point to an article in the Globe and Mail that is related to what the content of your newsletter is, you're okay. But this is going to be one of those circumstances that the CRTC is going to decide on a case-by-case basis. It's a fairly complicated question.
Yeah, and I would just take this opportunity to remind folks that this is brand new. These requirements are brand new. They're not yet enforced yet. The CRTC has gone ahead and continues to go ahead to issue interpretations on this, which is fairly unprecedented. A lot of the time this doesn't happen until requirements are already in place. So that's a plus, but at the same time, there's still a lot of this that I think all of us will, we will definitely be gaining certainty on this as things move forward. So a question I think I may have already answered is, at the point of sale when a customer is paying, can the sales clerk have the customer sign a form of consent to receive the company newsletter for company updates? And so the answer is yes. And again, just be cognizant of the method that you're doing this. Is this a standalone piece of paper where you could then, for the purpose of demonstrating that you have consent, will that stand on its own? Or would a lot of this be done verbally, in which case you would then have to document that was done verbally?
So the question is, how will this be enforced? Will emails, etc., be monitored? So there's two parts to that question. It'll be enforced by the CRTC. CRTC has and they're growing their enforcement staff. I think much of this will be driven by complaints. So people that complain of it, they will have a place to go to complain about receiving what they consider to be spam. Will emails be monitored? That they won't be monitored, but I think that's probably unlikely. I think that the more likely scenario is that emails will be requested by the CRTC from your service provider as a part of an investigation. So there is a provision within the Act that allows the CRTC or its designate to demand information from the service provider. That's how they're going to prove whether or not you were in violation of the Act.
I don't believe that the government has the time, money, or inclination to be monitoring people's emails. And I would also just remind folks about the private right of action provision that thankfully has been postponed until at least July 1st, 2017, that, as Scott mentioned, it will be oftentimes complaint from consumers or recipients or whatever that will often instigate these things, but there's nothing, certainly nothing in the legislation that limits enforcement and compliance activity to complaints.
Is record keeping of consent, is there an expected number of months, years that you're required to keep that. As we noted in the presentation, the CRTC can a proceeding anywhere up to, or an investigation anywhere up to 3 years after the violation is noted. So you probably want to keep it beyond that, because the complaint could come well after the actual infraction. So, for example, you send an email, and a month later somebody gets it in their inbox, and 2 weeks later they decide they don't like it, so they send it to the CRTC as a complaint. The CRTC has 3 years from that date to then go ahead and investigate and prosecute.
Next, I didn't understand the express consent part, or the example about not sign up to coupons and contests. Can you go over that again? So basically what that has to do with is express opt-in consent. So if you have a coupon, whether it is online or whether it is physical, and it is just a coupon for 40% off or whatever, or it's a contest to enter to go down south or whatever, and please provide your email address, and that's it. That is not CASL compliant express and opt-in consent. That's not acceptable. And into that, if you were to just follow up to that with the coupon or promotion, if you followed up with an email saying, hey, you've entered, by the way, would you like to sign up for our newsletter? That, after July 1st, will not be acceptable, because that first point of contact, that first commercial point of contact cannot be done via a commercial electronic message. What will be acceptable, though, whether online or physically in person, you have a 40% off coupon or a trip down south or something like that, and then separate to that, not tied to that, it could physically be on the same piece of paper or whatever, but their person consenting or not consenting has no bearing on whether they're entered in the contest. If you have then a checkbox at the bottom of that saying, yes, I consent to receiving your letter, that's acceptable. But the person has to also be able to get that coupon or enter that contest without providing their consent.
The next is, what about advertising by fax? Is that also considered a CEM? No, a fax is not considered a CEM. It's not a commercial electronic message, because it's not sent by electronic means. It's sent through a voice-based telephone system. So that's a different set of regulations.
I'd like clarification on implied consent. For example, we are a membership-based organization. When a member signs up, they can provide their email address for our database. Does this mean they are giving implied consent for us to communicate events, etc., to them, or do we still need to physically go out and obtain consent? I think the answer there is not so much around implied consent. I would rely more on the fact that you have an existing business relationship with that member. The fact that they've signed up to your organization means that you have an existing business relationship as opposed to applied consent. The other I would like to mention is that we are drafting a question and answers document on the Q's and A's that we had obtained through previous presentations, but also on this presentation as well. And that document, I expect, will be ready in the coming weeks. So just a reminder that first of all, the questions that we won't get to, we will get to in that Q&A document, and even the ones that we've already addressed here verbally, we will have that available to you in writing afterwards as well.
We don't have an e-commerce site, but send emails that are more content-based, for example, trends, styles, guides, etc. But at times, we do feature our in-store promotions and have links to our store finder page. We don't promote specific products, but we'll have a general message like skirts in store starting at $19.99. Would this type of messaging count as a CEM? Yes, absolutely, it will. You are attempting to sell something, so you need consent to be able to send those messages.
This is a really good question here. I'm actually a little bit surprised at that we haven't received questions about social media. So this question is, many companies use contests to gain Facebook likes. Will this practice discontinue as the consent is tied to entry in the contest itself? And so the answer is, it depends what the like is being used for. If the like is being used for consent to send a commercial electronic message, then that clearly that's not acceptable. And then, of course, if it's tied into the entry of the contest, then that's bundled and would not be acceptable either.
As a chamber, we have a membership base that we email to regularly about events, surveys, news, etc. Would an existing member be classified as a business relationship that we don't need to obtain consent from? That's correct. You have the existing business relationship, so the relationship is implied. The only caveat I would throw in there is that if that member leaves your membership and 2 years later you try to attempt to communicate with them, you could be in violation. So you may want to get an express consent from your members, even though you don't necessarily need it.
I believe we've already covered what constitutes a business relationship, and as I said, for most things, whether it's the sale or barter or any sort of transaction or anything like that, the existing business that constitutes an existing business relation. That's good for 2 years. And if it's an inquiry, it's also considered to be an existing business relationship, but that's only good for 6 months. That's actually defined in the Act, and I can't remember if it's Section 6 of the Act or not, but we'll follow up with that information for people that want to do additional reading with Saturday nights. We'll provide that in the written Q's and A's.
So next, we only send messages to our existing customers who have given us their email address as a point of contact. We've been sending them emails for a few months now. All our messages have an unsubscribe mechanism and an address info. Looks like we would be compliant. What do we do about new customers and adding them to our email list? So that is really about record keeping. You have that existing consent. What you want to do is going forward, make sure that you have the appropriate records that you're keeping and that the messages that you continue to send are CASL compliant.
So a reminder of the time. We have about 5 minutes left, so I imagine we have time for maybe 2 additional questions, which we'll do now. After which time I will pass the microphone back to Michelle. And just as a reminder that you can contact either Scott or myself at the contact information that's provided on your screen right now, and that there will be future sessions with the CRTC. There will be a checklist that will be provided as well as written Q's and A's. Okay. Oh, very good question, actually. Unsubscribe. From if they select this, or can we take them to a page that shows them all of their subscribes and can select their preferences? So the question here is, do you have to provide an unsubscribe mechanism, and that one unsubscribe mechanism, effectively the person would unsubscribe from everything that your organization is in, or would you be able to provide them with separate unsubscribes for separate information that you're sending them?
Answer to that is it depends on how you collected the consent in the first place. So if you have collected a single consent to send all types of messages, for instance, if you have multiple brands and you send out one consent for all of those brands, and your unsubscribe mechanism included is for those brands, then they unsubscribe them all. If you have sent out, or if you have consent for the different brands, then no, they would only subscribe from that particular message.
Yeah, Scott says it really comes down to a business decision, right? It becomes a business decision. You can have a request for all of you know, if you want it to written that way, all commercial electronic messaging from company X, in which case that makes things a little easier when you're requesting the consent. The problem there is that somebody then would be able to unsubscribe absolutely everything you're sending them. The business decision could also be made to maybe separate out 1, 2, or 3 or whatever forms and types of commercial electronic messages, which may be difficult then to more challenging to garner the consent at that point, but then allows the person to effectively type whatever they unsubscribe to in the future.
This last question here I think we have time for is actually a pretty good one. We're a retail organization with a loyalty program that goes back more than 10 years in some cases, and customers filled in a form to join these programs. Over the years, some customers have changed their email addresses from what originally entered on their enrollment form, or provided email addresses after their initial enrollment. Can we assume implied consent for the current email address based on the existing relationship with the customer? We have transactional records for these customers and can identify the last time a customer purchased from us. So a couple of things here. If you have a record of that change in email address, then you continue to have an express consent. That's valid. Optional record component of that question, what you have to be careful of is privacy legislation. So you may not be able to disclose some of those transactional records, and you may be able to use them as proof. So you need to be careful about that, and I suggest you get some legal advice on what's allowed under the PIPEDA.
All right. Well, on behalf of myself and the Retail Council of Canada, as well as my co-presenter Scott Smith and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to thank you for your time today and participating in this webinar. And please don't hesitate to contact either one of us if we haven't answered your question today. And we will be following up with this with further information on sessions with government, as well as checklists for comments and a written Q&A.